The storm didn't come overnight. The winds of war began with a whisper in courtrooms, in church pews, in state houses and cotton fields. Long before the first shot rang out at Fort Sumter, the United States was already at war with itself, in ideology, in economy, in identity. Welcome to episode 3 of The Birth of a Nation. I'm your host, Johnny Young. Today, we step into the crucible of American history, the Civil War and its aftermath, Reconstruction. It was a time of unimaginable loss and uncertain rebirth. But before we march into the battlefields, we must first understand the soil that fed the fire. Let's rewind to the early 19th century, a nation only half formed. There was no single America. There were two visions. One, a South rooted in agriculture, powered by the enslaved. Cotton was king and slavery was its engine. The other, a North industrializing rapidly with growing abolitionist movements calling slavery a moral blight. The Constitution had been a compromise, a balancing act between liberty and ownership. And that balance, it was tipping. Congress drew an invisible line across the Louisiana Territory. Slavery allowed south, banned to the north. Missouri entered as a slave state, Maine as free. It was a political band-aid, not a cure. Frederick Douglass, born into bondage, self-liberated and transformed into one of America's greatest orators. Douglass' voice was thunder, wrapped in reason. He once said, "I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them." His speeches electrified crowds in the North and terrified planners in the South. The 1830s and 1840s saw a shift. The South doubled down, expanding slavery westward with each new territory, and the North, it divided too. Not every Northern was an abolitionist. Many feared economic competition more than they mourned moral injustice. But the idea of slavery expanding into new states, that became intolerable to more and more Americans. Then came 1850. The Compromise of 1850. California entered the Union as a free state. The slave trade was abolished in D.C., but the Fugitive Slave Act was strengthened, requiring northern states to return escaped slaves. This law radicalized moderates. It brought the horror of slavery into northern homes. Abolitionist newspapers reprinted slave auction posters. Runaway narratives like Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave circulated like wildfire. The line between North and South was no longer just geographic, it was moral. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that humanized the enslaved in a way political pamphlets never could. Abraham Lincoln would later greet her by saying, "So you're the little lady who wrote the book that started this great war." Then came Kansas. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, it allowed the settlers of new territories to decide on slavery themselves. Popular sovereignty is what they called it. But instead of peaceful votes came war. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions flooded into Kansas, turning towns into battlegrounds. Abolitionist John Brown and his sons executed 5 pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek. The nation watched, horrified and mesmerized. John Brown, fanatic to some, saint to others, in 1859, he raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to arm enslaved people for rebellion. He failed. He was captured, tried, and hanged. But his final words rang throughout history. The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. Then came the ruling that tore the veil away completely. A man born in slavery sued for his freedom after living in free states. The Supreme Court's response: black people, free or enslaved, could never be citizens. Chief Justice Roger Taney's words shocked the North and emboldened the South. The ruling invalidated any attempt to restrict slavery in the territories. It wasn't just a court case, it was a declaration. The match was lit. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a little-known Illinois lawyer with no support in a southern state, was elected president. To the South, it was an act of war. Within weeks, South Carolina seceded from the Union, then Mississippi, then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. By February 1861, the Confederate States of America was born. They took the flag, wrote a constitution of their own, and waited. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. Brother turned on brother, the Union fractured, and the great experiment, the United States of America, stood on the brink of annihilation. But this was only the beginning. The war began with parades. In April of 1861, young men marched off to war believing they'd be home by Christmas. Both the Union and the Confederacy thought victory would be swift, decisive. They were wrong. What followed was 4 years of blood, fire, and sorrow, over 10,000 battles, skirmishes, and raids. From the muddy banks of the Mississippi to the rolling hills of Virginia, America became a battlefield soaked in its own contradiction. This was not a war of politics anymore. This was a war of survival. Manassas, Virginia. The Bull Run, July 1861. It was the first major battle of the war. Civilians from Washington packed picnics to watch what they believed would be a northern rout. Instead, chaos. Confederate General Thomas Jackson stood firm against Union attacks, earning the nickname Stonewall. The Union Army crumbled into retreat, and the North realized the truth. This war would not be quick or easy. As the war escalated, so too did the scale of destruction. By 1862, new names etched themselves into American consciousness: Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg. Each battle cost thousands of lives. Each one brought the country deeper into darkness. But amid the horror, another transformation was taking shape: a war for freedom. Abraham Lincoln entered office promising only to stop the spread of slavery, not to abolish it outright. But war changed Lincoln. He saw the Union not just as a political project, but a moral cause. By the mid-1862, he began crafting a new strategy, one that would redefine the very meaning of the war. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Was it a total abolition of slavery? No, it didn't apply to broader states loyal to the Union, but it did two crucial things. It gave moral purpose to the Union war effort, and it allowed black men to fight for their own liberation. Over 180,000 black soldiers enlisted in the Union Army. Another 20,000 served in the Navy. They fought not just for a flag, but for dignity, for family, for a future. At Fort Wagner, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by white Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, launched a near-suicidal assault. They failed to take the fort, but proved black soldiers would fight with unmatched valor. A Confederate general was quoted as saying, "If these people can fight, the war is over." By 1863, the war reached its pivot point, the fields of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 1st through the 3rd, 1863. Gettysburg. Over 160,000 soldiers clashed across 3 days, the largest battle ever fought on American soil. Day 1, the Confederates pushed Union forces throughout the town. Day 2, savage fighting at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield. And Day 3, Pickett's Charge, a doomed assault across open ground that decimated the Confederate Army. More than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The South would never again invade the North. Just months later, Lincoln returned to dedicate the battlefield cemetery. In less than 300 words, he reframed the war's purpose: that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. It was not just a eulogy, it was a rebirth. But the war raged on. In the West, General Ulysses S. Grant laid siege to Vicksburg, cutting the Confederacy in two. In the East, General William Tecumseh Sherman took a different approach: total war. Sherman marched from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, a path of destruction 60 miles wide. He burned crops, destroyed railroads, leveled homes, not to punish civilians, but to break the Southern will to fight. His message was brutal, but clear. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. The Confederacy was bleeding. Its economy was shattered. Its armies were starving, but its pride remained intact. For a time. Finally, in April 1865, Union troops surrounded General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. On April 9th, Lee surrendered to Grant. The war officially was over. When Grant and Lee met, there was no bitterness. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers could return home with their horses and their dignity. The war ended not in vengeance, but in grace. Over 620,000 Americans were dead, more than any other war in U.S. history. Cities were burned, families shattered, and entire regions lay in ruins. But perhaps the greatest question remained. Now that the Union had been preserved, what kind of nation would it become? With the war behind them, Americans faced a new battlefield, rebuilding the South, redefining freedom, and resisting the rise of new forms of oppression. The war had ended, but peace was far more complicated. In April of 1865, as Confederate forces surrendered, the United States faced a monumental task: to rebuild a shattered South, redefine citizenship, and honor the sacrifices made on the battlefield. This period, known as Reconstruction, will become one of the most ambitious, turbulent, and transformative eras in American history. At its heart were three questions. How should the South be reintegrated into the Union? What rights would newly freed Black Americans possess? And who would enforce the answers? Lincoln had a plan, one of leniency. He wanted reconciliation, not revenge. His 10% plan offered amnesties to Southerners who swore loyalty to the Union and accepted emancipation. But just days after General Lee's surrender, Lincoln was assassinated. It was April 14th, 1865, which was a Good Friday. At Ford's Theater, actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger. The nation mourned, but Reconstruction and its leadership shifted dramatically. Lincoln's successor was a Southern Democrat and former slaveholder who lacked Lincoln's moral vision. President Andrew Johnson offered blanket pardons to many former Confederates. He opposed equal rights for freedmen. He vetoed civil rights legislation. In many ways, Johnson's leniency emboldened the South to resist change. But Congress had other ideas. Radical Republicans led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner believed in a revolution of rights. They pushed for laws that would not just end slavery, but secure equality. 3 constitutional amendments changed the nation forever. The 13th Amendment of 1865 abolished slavery, except as punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment, 1868, guarantees citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment, 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. On paper, America was reborn. In practice, resistance surged. In the years that followed, the South became a battlefield once again, but this time the weapons were laws, intimidation, and violence. The rise of the Ku Klux Klan in 1865 by former Confederate officers became a terrorist organization bent on restoring white supremacy. They targeted black voters, teachers, ministers, anyone who represented freedom. Burning crosses, lynchings, night rides, these were isolated incidents. They were part of a broader campaign of racial terror. Congress responded with the Enforcement Acts, empowering federal troops to break the Klan's hold. For a time, it worked. Despite the violence, Reconstruction achieved remarkable process. Hundreds of black men were elected to local, state, and even federal offices, including Senators Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. Public schools were built across the South, many for the first time. Freedmen's Bureau provided food, housing, and education to newly freed people. It was, for a moment, a glimpse at multiracial democracy, but that moment was short-lived. And one of the most contested presidential elections in U.S. history, Rutherford B. Hayes won the presidency through a backroom deal. In exchange, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and Reconstruction was over. What followed was the rise of Jim Crow, a segregation laws that codified racial inequalities for generations. The South had lost a war, but regained control. The promise of Reconstruction was real, but so was the backlash. And yet, in the ashes of that dream, seeds were planted. The right to vote, the expectation of equality, the belief that America could be something more. Reconstruction didn't fail. It was overthrown. The years following the Civil War weren't just about repairing buildings or repaving roads. They were about redefining freedom itself. And that made Reconstruction the most radical and most resisted experiment in American democracy. Let's reflect on what was gained, what was lost, and what echoes forward to today. Between 1865 and 1877, the United States undertook unprecedented reforms. Over 4 million enslaved people were freed. 3 new constitutional amendments redefined citizenship and voting rights. The first public school system emerged in southern states. Black Americans participate in government at every level, from sheriff to the U.S. senators. It was a bold attempt at racial justice in a nation still bleeding from war. But boldness invited backlash. Freedom, it turns out, is not the same as equality. As Union troops withdrew in 1877, part of the compromise that ended Reconstruction, the South rapidly reasserted white dominance. Before the dust of war had even settled, the Southern states enacted black codes, laws that sought to control, limit, and exploit the freedom of formerly enslaved people. These codes prevented black people from voting, owning property, or testifying in court, criminalized vagrancy, effectively forcing many back into unpaid labor, created new systems of convict leasing, where prisons rented out black labor to private businesses. This was slavery by any other name. Over the next 2 decades, these laws evolved into Jim Crow, a legalized system of segregation and disenfranchisement that would last into the 60s. Frederick Douglass, a towering figure in American history, had been a formerly enslaved man, a self-educated writer, and a powerful abolitionist. After the war, he continued to push for civil rights, especially the vote. He said, "Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot." Douglass lived long enough to see Reconstruction rise and collapse, yet he never stopped believing in America's promise. In 1875, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing racial discrimination in public accommodations. But it would be struck down by the Supreme Court just 8 years later. This would become a pattern. For every step forward, a pushback. For every promise, a loophole. As the South rebuilt, a new narrative emerged, one that romanticized the Confederacy and sanitized the truth of slavery. Statues were erected, textbooks were rewritten. The Civil War became, in some retellings, not about slavery, but states' rights. This myth distorted generations of understanding and shaped American memory for more than a century. But the fact remains, Reconstruction was not a mistake. It was a promise, unfulfilled. Today, we still wrestle with the same questions Reconstruction posed. What does freedom really mean? Who gets to vote, to govern, to belong? Can a nation founded on inequality ever truly become equal? The echoes of 1865 are heard in every fight for civil rights, in every protest for justice, in every ballot cast. Reconstruction didn't end in 1877. Its story just entered a new chapter, one that continues to this day. We began this episode in the ashes of war. We ended in the fragile dawn of freedom. Not perfect, not complete, but a beginning.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, and share the podcast with others who love history and global stories. Got a correction, a suggestion, or a country you'd like featured? Reach out. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, every nation has a story worth telling.